I am Freud Sintaya, as I said, to introduce myself, and an assistant professor of political science and international relations, and also a board member of Good Governance Africa, Eastern Africa. I'd like to thank everyone for coming here to attend today's webinar. And today we'll be having 4 presentations by 4 of our presenters. So basically what I'm going to do is to introduce our presenters briefly, and then we'll have maximum of 20 minutes of presentation from each presenter, and that will be followed by discussion, and we'll be closing with a brief closing remark by the Executive Director of Good Governance Africa, Eastern Africa. So to introduce our presenters, I'll start with the first presenter, who is Dr. Asnaga Kafala. So they'll be presenting alphabetically. We'll start with a presentation on Ethiopia, followed by Rwanda, and the last one will be on Sudan. And then we'll have a sort of a summary of all the cases, including from the session that we had in the previous week, last week. So the first presenter will be Dr. Asnaga Kafala. He's an associate professor of political science and international relations at Addis Ababa University. He has long years of experience in teaching and researching in various areas of political science, and he has published a number of books, book chapters, articles on federalism, conflict management, political economy, and migration. And the second presenter will be Dr. Frederick Goloba Mutebi. I hope I have pronounced your name correctly. Sorry if I didn't. He's a Ugandan, but today he'll be presenting on Rwanda. And he's an independent researcher and consultant, and he has served a number of organizations, including ODI, Overseas Development Institute, the World Bank, Irish Aid, SIDA, USAID, and others. The third presenter will be Dr. Hassan Hamid Musheika, and he's from the University of Khartoum. And today he will be presenting the case on Sudan. And the last presenter, last but not least, will be Dr. Fagada Tarafa. He will be basically summarizing the issues being raised from different cases, including from the last week. He's a program officer at Good Governance Africa, Eastern Africa. He's a political scientist by profession and contributed a number of research in the area, publications in the area. All the presentations will be on decentralization and local governance in Eastern Africa, taking the specific cases. So the first case will be presented by Dr. Asnaga on Ethiopia, and that will be followed by Dr. Rwanda and Dr. Hassan Hamid on Sudan, summary that I talked about earlier. Now we'll start with the presentation by Dr. Asnaga. So Dr. Asnaga, you can very glad if you can to 15 minutes if you. We also have a presentation from last week on Sudan. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Prayot, for the introduction. I also thank Good Governance for Africa, Eastern Africa, for organizing this seminar and also for inviting me for this presentation. My presentation, as Priyot said, will be about Ethiopian case, decentralization and local government in the Ethiopian context since 1991. While I was wondering about the situation, particularly since 2015, I was trying to understand the situation of local government from the context of party hegemony, protest, and politics of transition. So all these things had enormously impacted on local government institutions and the way local government governance is going on. So the purpose of this paper is to critically examine the state of decentralization in local government. Yeah, the purpose of this paper is to critically examine the state of decentralization and local governance in the context of the demise of the hegemonic project of the former ruling coalition, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF, the politics of protests that engulfed the country since 2015, and the volatile politics of transition, which is still going on, that started in 2018. The paper is produced by Review of Secondary Literature, Laws, Newspaper and Magazine Reports. I have four major contentions in this paper. The first contention is the nature of decentralization and local governance in the post-1991 period in Ethiopia could be more explained by politico-economic processes than legal and institutional approaches. When you look at the Constitution talks about self-government, self-determination, local autonomy. Even if in the Constitution, local governments were not mentioned, there was this tendency. Ethiopia has decentralized, devolved, is experimenting ethnic federalism, autonomy has been provided. But when you look at actual decentralization and devolution at the local level, more things could be explained by political processes, political economy, patronage, and other factors, rather than the formal and institutional setup. The second contention that I have in this paper, in the period from 1995, the introduction of the Constitution, to 2015, autonomy and regional and sub-regional local governments were re-centralized by the former EPRDF. Even if autonomy was provided to the regions by the Constitution, there was re-centralization of power by the party structure. Even if the EPRDF was a coalition, it was operated as if it was a unitary one-party system. The political ideology that was implemented, that was followed by the EPRDF, revolutionary democracy, democratic centralism, helped to re-centralize power. As a result, local government institutions, even if in their institutional setup, they were very much different, probably improved in their facilities, in their bureaucracy, in comparison to the past. But in effect, local government institutions, they were as a districts, and even sub-district formations, sub-cabinet formations were used by the political party to control and mobilize people. So there was a continuation of the tradition of local governance from the imperial times or the Derg times. There was not that much of substantive difference with respect to local government institutions after 1995. The third contention that I have in this paper, the protests that started in 2015 and continued to 2018 led to the introduction of state of emergencies. 2 state of emergencies were declared. Formal and informal command posts. Command post, even the idea, the concept itself is interesting. It was borrowed from a military organization. It is about one central authority, decision-making center, almost all government institutions coming together to implement policies, to implement security kinds of operations. This concept was borrowed by the government, and formal and informal command posts were established in several parts of the country. And these effectively undermined not only autonomy, local governance was highly compromised because of these situations. In the fourth contentions that I have in this paper, post 2018 politics of contestation, the shattering of the political settlement of post 1991 period, the dominance of the APRDF, ethnic federalism, all these things hugely undermined local government, the civil war, emergence of irregular formations used as organizations. These days, in several regions, we have also irregular kinds of organizations, some armed, some not armed, and also the weakening of the political center because of disagreement, this power struggle within the political center, the conflict between the federal government and Tigray region. All these confrontations undermined or weakened the central government, and this led to the weakening of local governance. You might think the weakening of the political center might lead to enhanced autonomy to local government institutions, but I rather argue in this period, I rather argue the situation led to the decline of local governance in much of the country, throughout the country. These are the four major contentions that I have in this paper. So I will organize my presentation on the basis of these contentions. First, how do I understand, how do we locate local government in the context of the Ethiopian ethno-federal system? Ethiopia follows an ethno-federal system with 9 regions, 2 city administrations. Recently, 2 regional states were added. So local government is like the classic definition of local governments in the study of political science is infra-sovereign entities which do not have sovereignty. So they come, in the case of federal states, they come below the federating unit, the federal state. So in the Ethiopian case, local government institutions come under the regional governments, but there is also this problematic because in the Ethiopian federal system, nations, nationalities, and peoples are recognized as sovereign. The preamble of the Constitution says, we nations, nationalities, and peoples have agreed to come together and establish this federal pact. So local government institutions established on the basis of ethnicity, identity have, even if the level of autonomy differs, the bigger regions have, the bigger ethnicities, Amhara, Oromo, Somali, Tigray have their own regions, but even the smaller ethnic groups, which are recognized as nations, nationalities, and peoples, have their own zones, in some cases, special woreda. So I differ from other scholars who argue that in the Ethiopian case, all local government institutions which are under the regional governments should be defined as local governments. I say like zonal administrations, even if like in the South, zonal administrations, even if they come under the regional government, they have some form of autonomy, like the Sidama, for instance, who mobilize themselves and effectively work to establish their own regional government through a referendum. Even if their level of autonomy was below a regional government, they could be defined, they cannot be defined as ordinary local governments. So in the Ethiopian case, it is a bit complicated. I argue local governments in those regions dominated by single ethnicities like Amhara, Somali, Tigray, and others, local governments come straight next to the national government, the regional government. But in regional governments like the southern region, even the special woreda have some aspect of sovereignty, and in these cases, local governments could come under the special woreda. Local government structure and autonomy in the Ethiopian case. Local governments and municipalities have almost similar structures, powers. When a review of the constitutions of the regions is made, some of the regions are not clear with respect to the with respect to the powers and responsibilities of local governments. Some are very clear, but when you look at the situation, almost all local governments exercise similar kinds of powers. They are responsible for education till secondary education. They are responsible for health services. They run health stations and clinics. They are responsible for agriculture. Almost all the waradas, the districts have, they have councils, executive cabinets, judicial departments, and also many of the regions have local government structures below the Kabale. Almost all of the regions have Kabales, and below the Kabale, there are institutions. In the Oromia region, it was called Garre. In Amara region, it was called Goat. Some even like during the heydays of the EPRDF, there were even 1 to 5 kinds of structures, like 5 households were organized and monitored by Kabale officials. The Warada has authority to plan and implement its own economic development and social service programs. It has also the duty to implement policies and laws of the federal and regional governments. Since the introduction of the district level decentralization program in 2002, 2003, autonomy has been given to local governments. Their institutional setup was improved, and even the federal government decided, in fact, forced the regional governments to transfer grants, subsidies on a base of a formula to the Warada. So the Warada now allocate their own budget. This reform, local government reform, was interestingly adopted after the split within the TPLF. So some of the regions challenged the power of the prime minister. So one of the quick decisions of the federal government under the leadership of the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi was to strengthen local governments and reduce the powers of the regional authorities, particularly the fiscal power, the financial power was reduced because regional governments were forced to transfer subsidy to the Warada on the basis of formulas. But when you look at the constitution, unlike many other federal constitutions, the Ethiopia federal constitution does not give protection to local governments. Local governments are under the exclusive control of regional governments. It is a regional legislation that establishes local governments. Regional governments can also disestablish local governments, can fire and hire their officials. Decentralization and recentralization from 1995 to 2015. The hegemonic project of the APRDF ran counter to the idea, the ethos of decentralization, devolution, federalization of the politics of the country. APRDF and its allies manned all districts and regions, even if a multi-party system was introduced in this period. Even now, all the regions and all the districts were manned by the dominant party, the vanguard party. Opposition parties usually boycott local elections. The opposition parties also contributed to the weakening of local autonomy because they never really seriously competed in local elections. District and sub-district units were used for mobilization and control rather than fostering grassroots participation. The institutionalization and strengthening of local governments that was started after 2002 was thwarted after the 2005 elections. In the wake of the elections, the APRDF introduced several policies and practices that further undermined local participation. For instance, in the Oromia region, right after the elections, many of the cities in the Oromia region, the southern region, voted for the opposition party during the 2005 election. one of the decisions that was made by the Oromia region was all mayors within the region became appointed by the regional government, the regional president. So the content of local participation autonomy was dashed. And also the size of municipalities was expanded. The geography of municipalities was expanded in order to bring more people from the countryside, so that the so-called non-indigenous groups who could be dominant in the cities could not dominate the politics of the municipalities. Very interestingly, in 2008, the EPRDF also introduced a new legislation. By this legislation, it massively expanded the composition, the number of seats in local councils, Warada and Kabali councils. For example, the Kabali council, the number of members of Kabali councils before 2008 was 15, but after 2008, it became 300. So for about 4 million candidates had to run for Kabali elections across the country. This was not possible for the opposition parties. It was a deliberate move by the EPRDF to disallow opposition parties from competing for local council seats. In the preparation for the 2010 elections, the EPRDF not only massively expanded its membership, but also innovated new systems of control, sub-Kabali structures, the 1-to-5 network, and the elections were led by a command post the party established. This command post was interestingly led by Barakat Simon, who was one of the top political operatives of the EPRDF. And an army was like the EPRDF also started to establish what it called an army of supporters. And these institutions heavily mobilized the public. And the EPRDF probably, I think the political problems, I could say, major political problems started at this time. The party won more than 97% of the seats. And the command post and also the army was later on expanded and used for development purposes. After 2005, as you would remember, there was a developmental state. These instruments were also used by the party for developmental state. Interestingly, starting from 2008 up until now, there were no local elections. Now, unelected appointees of regional governments are running local governments. As a result, it's difficult to talk about local autonomy and local participation. Next, we will have the period from 2015 to 2018. Now, is the period of command posts, local governments, and the politics of protest. The EPRDF faced unprecedented opposition since 2015. The state of emergency was declared in 2016 and it stayed till 2018. Local governments, in conjunction with command posts, which brought civil, security, political, and military officials in one command, they were used to quell opposition to the EPRDF. But the long power struggle within the EPRDF appears to have radically undermined the historical role of local governments to suppress dissent to the political center. In some instances, local cadres openly joined the protesters who were calling for democratic reforms. Retrospect, political leaders who were opposed to the dominance of the TPLF within the EPRDF worked with the young protesters and used the local authorities either to keep a blind eye or support the protesters. As a result, this created a power vacuum in many cases, particularly during the politics of transition. For about several months, almost there was no central political authority. And this political power vacuum was filled by different elements. Contestation for political power at a local level started. A range of actors became important actors in local governance: party officials, armed formations, irregular groups, and others. This hugely undermine what I've said earlier, local governance in many parts of the country. The ongoing conflict has also greatly undermined local authorities. The securitization of local administration in some cases has also political and economic dimension. Local authorities benefit from disorder, the security budget. Some probably have also strong relationships with irregular formations. In many regions, local governments are now struggling to carry out their functions. In those regions affected by violent conflict, local governments are not even able to provide law and order. So, Freud, Madam Chair, I'm coming to the conclusion. So to conclude, the post-1991 political system reordered local governments. After 2002 reforms, local governments were given autonomy and better institutional standing, but there is no federal constitutional protection to local governments. The powers and functions of local governments are not clearly defined across regions. Local governments continued their historic role of control and mobilize the public in the post-1991 period till 2015, I would say. A rapid increment in the number of local governments since 2005 as a way of pacifying popular demands. Many waredas, like if you look at the statistics, many regions have increased the number of waredas, but that has not improved delivery of services. Rather, it was meant to satisfy political entrepreneurs, opposition, movements, or cadres within the political structure. In the post-2018 period, local governments appear to be in a very weak position. The power of the center has also declined. The reason for the decline of local government's authority is the contestation for power. There is also a democratic deficit in the current situation of local politics. No elections were held since 2008. Opposition parties do not that much participate in local elections. In the post-2018 politics, local governments were not given the attention they required by both the ruling party and the opposition. And it is important to strengthen local governments by renewing their popular mandate to enhance democratic participation and accountability. I would even add one last point. Political stability, the disorders that we have at the national level, at regional level, cannot be amended if a new thinking is not introduced at the local level. If local government institutions are not going to be strengthened, I don't think there will be an easy way out from the political quagmire the country is currently in. I thank you for your attention, and I end my presentation here. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation, Dr. Asnaga. So I will go to the next presentation by Dr. Frederick Golob in the interest of time, so that we also have time for discussion after the three presentations. Dr. Frederick, please stick to maximum 20 minutes, and if you can, kindly request you to even reduce it to 15 minutes so that we have time for discussion. So he'll be presenting on decentralization and local governance in Rwanda. Dr. Frederick.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to just speak from notes. Also, one thing that I want to point out is that my presentation is looking at decentralization in Rwanda from pretty much a technocratic point of view, because in Rwanda, decentralization was implemented within a context of, what can I call it? Maybe even no party rule or single party rule. It was in a context where there were no different competing centers of power. So decentralization in Rwanda started in 1996, and this is 2 years after the genocide against the Tutsi and after the Civil War. Now, Rwanda was still pretty much in a very difficult political situation. And it's even surprising that they would have opted to carry out a decentralization program so early, even when the state was still very weak and hardly able to do many things. Now, in going for decentralization, Rwanda was following in the steps of many other African countries which had started their decentralization reforms much earlier. Now, one thing about Rwanda is that it was not pushed by donors to go for decentralization. Decentralization was pretty much a homegrown initiative. But it happened within a context where donors were very keen they were very keen on decentralization, and therefore it provided an opening for Rwanda to get support, financial, technical, even political, from donors. And that support explains to a very large extent the gains that Rwanda has made with decentralization. Now, decentralization was a response to the civil war and to the genocide against the Tutsi. And it was a response in the sense that the new government judged that the success of the genocide, or the speed with which it had happened, had a lot to do with the over-centralization of decision-making. And as a result of lack of decision-making power on the part of local governments. So they opted for decentralization in order to undermine the spirit of subservience and obedience that had been cultivated over 3 decades prior to the arrival in power of the Rwanda Patriotic Front. Now, in terms of particulars, if we look at the local government structure in Rwanda that resulted from this decentralization program, Rwanda today has a rather small number of districts. It has 30 districts. These are further divided into 416 sectors, which are then divided into 2,148 cells. At the bottom is the village, and there are 14,837 villages in Rwanda. Now, at the top of the districts, which are the basic unit of administration, are provinces. Now, there are 4 provinces, including the city of Kigali, which is divided into 3 districts. Now, provinces are led by governors who are appointed by the president, but districts and other units of local government are led by elected leaders who are elected through either universal adult suffrage, if we are talking of councillors, but mayors of districts are elected by electoral colleges of elected councillors. Now, districts, as I pointed out, are the basic unit of administration, and these are supposed to enjoy administrative and financial autonomy. Now, their roles are pretty much service delivery roles, but also beyond that, they are supposed to provide good governance and socio-economic advancement, promote intra-society solidarity, and this is directly to address the effects of the genocide and how much it divided society, but also to formulate and implement service delivery and development policies. Now, the sectors below the districts have policy implementation responsibilities, especially in the area of service delivery. The cells also provide services and mobilize residents to identify and discuss matters of common interest and collective concern with a view to resolving them. Now, at the village level, the village is the point of immediate identification of problems that need to be addressed. And it is here that first attempts to address these problems are made before they are referred upwards to cells, sectors, and ultimately districts. Villages are also sites of mobilization of collective action. And those who are familiar with how Rwanda works, there is the famous Umuganda program, or community work program, whereby every last Saturday of the month, the entire country pretty much comes to a standstill. That is because people in their communities are cleaning up their communities. And this is from early in the morning up to midday. Now, this is the mobilization for this work is done at the village level. Now, if we look at other aspects of decentralization and the things that decentralization sought to achieve, decentralization was meant to be an instrument for ensuring that ordinary people take part in decision-making, to ensure that the citizens' voices are heard in whatever decisions are made at the local level. Now, this also meant that elected leaders are supposed to be held to account by ordinary people in their communities because they elect them. So if they do not take into consideration the opinions of local people who elect them, the idea is that local people can then vote them out of office. Now, decentralization is enshrined in the Rwandan Constitution of 2003, and it has been operationalized through a series of national laws and policies. But there are also specific laws that define the key structures of local government, the procedures for decision-making, regulations, as well as guidelines. Some of these have been changed over time since 1996 in response to realities on the ground. There are areas where local governments have been granted autonomy and where some of the powers have been retained by the central government. Now, in terms of institutional arrangements for implementing decentralization, there is a National Decentralization Stakeholders Forum. There is a Program Steering Committee. There is a National Decentralization Implementation Secretariat, and this is housed in the Rwanda Governance Board. Now, the Rwanda Governance Board is a government entity that is charged with monitoring governance at local level, especially, and following up what local governments are doing, and periodically doing surveys to establish levels of satisfaction by members of the public with what local governments are doing, but also looking at the quality of the services that are delivered by local governments. There is also the decentralization, there are decentralization focal points in every ministry and at all provincial level. And all these institutional arrangements complement the efforts made by the Ministry of Local Government and the Rwanda Governance Board to ensure that the objectives of decentralization are achieved. Now, in terms of the impacts of all these things on the way decentralization works in practice, we have local elections in Rwanda, and these are made to ensure, as I pointed out, that local leaders are subject to the vote and are therefore open to being held to account by members of the public. Now, we have local councils that are established as a result of popular elections, and these have considerable oversight powers over the district executive that is responsible for day-to-day running of districts. Now, local councils ensure, among other things, that citizens' priorities are reflected in decision-making at district level. But of course, there are some limitations here, and some of these include inadequate budgets. Inadequate budgets mean that not every wish of the public can be put into effect because there isn't enough money to do some of the things that the public might want to see done. The other one is that councillors who sit in district councils are part-time, or rather do their work part-time. They're not permanent employees of local governments. And of course, this means that they don't devote full-time their energy and attention to what is happening at local government level. There is also the problem of lack of skills and experience among councillors, because a lot of them, when they're elected, they have never really served in local government. So their lack of skills and experience does somewhat affect the effectiveness of district councils. Now, in terms of accountability, the central government retains critical powers. And this is because the government of Rwanda judged that decentralizing power completely to local governments if it was done, it would happen within a context of quite major weaknesses within local government structures that would open decentralization to what many of us would be familiar with, and that is elite capture. So the central government retains significant powers of supervision and inspection and holding local governments to account, in addition to the powers that have all the openings that have been created for members of the public to oversee what local governments do and to hold elected leaders to account. Now, in terms of shortfalls in practicing decentralization, or factors that undermine decentralization in Rwanda, one is administrative and human resource constraints. Now, local governments are supposed to recruit, pay, deploy, and sanction their employees. Now, this is very important for accountability, but in practice, as I pointed out, absence of critical skills mean that local governments are actually not able to fulfill many of their responsibilities because there are critical skills lacking at local level. And some of those are in engineering. Local governments are not able to recruit enough economists or even statisticians. And so this does somewhat impact their capacity to live up to the expectations that they're made to live up to. Now, the other one are financial challenges. Local governments, of course, need resources to execute their functions, but also, in addition to this, very important observation that has to be done that has to be made is that local governments need significant capacities to generate their own revenue in order to fund parts of their budgets. Now, what we observe in Rwanda is that local governments are highly dependent on intergovernmental fiscal transfers. And part of the reason here is that they are very poor at revenue mobilization from their own populations. And what this means is that local governments have very limited discretionary power to determine expenditure on priorities because significant parts of their budgets are funded by the center. Now, there are reasons why local governments face constraints in terms of own revenue mobilization. Now, one of them is the limited range of revenue sources, especially in rural areas. There is also the problem of poverty in rural areas, in that there are not very many people that can realistically be taxed. But also the issue of weakness, which is linked to lack of skills in terms of planning, assessment, and tax administration. Now, the other factor or the other constraints that local governments face have to do with procurement and contract management, as well as investment management. Now, all these are linked to the rather serious lack of skills that local governments inevitably experience. Now, there are also issues to do with planning. Planning is supposed to be a decentralized function. However, there is a lack of coherence between central and local government planning processes. There is a certain misalignment between district planning priorities and sectoral plans. There are no functioning statistical or offices, nor do local governments have a great deal of monitoring and evaluation capacity. In most cases, local governments lack reliable administrative data, and this has to do with the weaknesses in recruiting skilled people in terms of statisticians and so on. If we look at local autonomy and accountability, as I pointed out, the central government retains quite significant powers to intervene in local government, but also to direct and control what local governments do. Now, conventional wisdom usually has it that where you have central government retaining this kind of power, there is a problem and it amounts to undermining decentralized entities. My contention here is that this is highly debatable. I think that it's really context. One has to judge it in terms of the context. And from my experience, both in Rwanda and also looking at Uganda, decentralization of the devolution type, where local governments are supposed to be given significant powers of autonomy, usually encounters problems in the sense that there are not very many skills out there. There are not many skilled people that want to go and work for local governments, especially in rural and remote areas. But also the propensity for local elected elites to hijack processes and resources at local level is so high that if local governments are left to their own devices, the autonomy can actually undermine their effectiveness. Now, if we look at Rwanda in terms of what remains to be done or what areas one could suggest for further reform, this whole idea of members of the public having the capacity to contribute to discussions and decision-making at the local level, I think that it's a good idea, but it has serious limitations. In that whether it's physical meetings or physical interaction between elected leaders and members of the public, there are serious limitations there because members of the public, especially in rural areas, spend a great deal of their time trying to eke out a living. They are spending time on their farms, they are trading, they are doing all kinds of things. So in terms of physical meetings or community meetings, there are serious gaps there in that it cannot always be made to happen. Now, if one looks at, in terms of accountability, if one considers the fact that the central government possesses significant powers of oversight, I think that one has to think about how this can be addressed so that the central governments can, or the central government can cede some powers to local authorities. I think that what one would advocate for here is significant energy put into building the capacity of local governments to make them capable of performing some of the functions for which they are responsible without necessarily being actively supervised from the center. Now, in terms of leadership capacity, we all like this idea of elected leaders at local level. but there are not always a lot of, or rather large numbers of skilled and experienced people at local level to go around. So periodic elections, especially where the time period between one election and another is short, create crises in local governments in terms of skills, because almost every election leads to a fairly high turnover of local leaders, and it leads to coming in of newly elected leaders, many of which usually don't have good skills for performing the function that they're supposed to perform. Now, this calls for leadership development programs. But still, I think that one of the things we need to debate is where there are not large reservoirs of skilled, experienced people, what contribution do regular elections at local government level make, and to what extent can they be disruptive in terms of depriving local governments of skills, because people have to be elected, and every election seems to take out a lot of skills that might otherwise benefit local governments. Now, there is also the issue of the balance between private and public provision of services at the local level. In some cases, I think that there is an argument that can be made for privatizing some of the services, especially, for instance, in Rwanda, we have the privatization of water provision, whereby water sources are put in the hands of private providers who then provide these services to the public in return for fairly small amounts of money. The problem with this is that the capacity of local governments to supervise these providers effectively can also be limited, in which case some of these things can be open to abuse. So there is a question about what would be the best way to create a balance between public provision and private provision. Now, there is also, in terms of local government capacity, there is the issue of staffing, equipment, and facilitation. Now, if you look at the hierarchy of local government in Rwanda, you find that some of the levels of local government are seriously lacking in equipment and facilities. For instance, if you look at the cell level, there is not usually space for people to work in, nor do they have all the equipment that they need. Now, the question this poses is what level of responsibility should be given to what level of local government if decentralization is to be made to work. Now, in terms of revenue mobilization, how can local governments be enabled to collect more revenue? It seems to me as if local governments have to be equipped with the capacity to not only assess assess members of the public or even local government, local businesses for tax collection, but also to be able to maintain tax registers, collect data that allows for assessments to be done in the correct way. And all these things call for significant levels of capacity building. So, yeah, now in terms of conclusion, if one looks at decentralization in Rwanda, a great deal of achievements have been made in terms of service provision, in terms of bringing local people into decision-making processes. But given the capacity constraints, which I have pointed to, given the contradictions between the amount of responsibility one ought to give to local governments and how much of it should be retained at the center, I think there is a great deal of work that remains to be done. But I would also suggest that possibly people like us need to debate this whole idea of local government autonomy within the context of countries such as ours, where there is very little capacity at local government level. to manage some of the very serious responsibilities that are given to local governments. I'll stop here and wait for the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mutebi. Okay, for that very rich presentation on the state of decentralization and local governance in Rwanda, we'll now directly go to Dr. Mesheka's presentation on decentralization and local governance in Sudan. Dr. Musheka, can you please stick to the 20 minutes, and hopefully if you can 15 minutes, so that we'll have discussion, so that we'll have a summary of all the presentations and also discussion afterwards. The floor is yours. Can you please unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Can you hear me, please?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Hassan Musheka, Associate Professor of Political Science, Department of University of Khartoum, Sudan, yes. This paper contains decentralization and local governance concepts and definitions, and then decentralization and local governance in Sudan during the period 1991 to 2019. This is a period of Benghazi government. Then following December 2018, then I will move to decentralization after the Juba Peace Agreement, October 2020. And then the role of non-state actors and the private sector in the decentralized system of government in Sudan. And then the betterment of governance at all levels or at 3/3 of government. And the paper concluded with the result and recommendation. I'm not going in depth about concept and definitions. I'll go directly to decentralization in Sudan during the period 1991. In fact, Sudan adopted federal system in 1991. And this federal system implemented in non-democratic environment and lacked a rigid constitution. As we know, federalism, one of the prerequisites of federalism is the rigid constitution. This system also produced unpopular policies between the dominant central, the dominant central government in Khartoum, and most of the peripheral state. The central government in Khartoum controlled the most controversial political issues, marginalized all districts, and didn't uphold on the rule of law. And we know rule of law is one of the 6 dimensions of the good governance. The unfair further policies led to whispered conflict between the central government on one hand and the subnational state on the other hand. So in July 2011, South Sudan became officially a separate state with its own sovereignty. And this is a very important issue. Part of Sudan created new state. This federalism and decentralization in Sudan following December, after adopting the constitution which recognized Sudan as a federal state, this happened in 1998, democracy has not been presented as condition of proper federalism. And there is no federalism without democracy. Democracy is very important for federalism. Local government is the third level of governance in the decentralized system of Sudan. We have federal government, and we have 18 states and 198 councils or localities. The third level of governance in this decentralized system of Sudan is always marginalized by other level of government. And many local government acts were established and adopted during this period, 1991 up to now. In 1995, there was an act, and also in 1998 and 2013 also. The responsibility of local government during this period preceding the transitional government in 1994 to 2019. The third level of government failed to provide basic service to the local citizen and hesitated to create successful partnership with society organizations. Weakness in local governance has continued clearly in most peripheral states and localities in Sudan. The availability of space and the role of private sector and actors were totally absent in most of the local government. Their role in designing policy, I'm talking here about public policy, not only the policy in the local level, the designing policy are very important to support the logistic aspect of governance. Decentralization after the Juba Peace Agreement, October 2020, according to this peace, the President of Sovereign Council signed a decree in 2020 announcing a new decentralized system in Sudan. In fact, the paradox here is that the adoption of the new decentralization wasn't mainly based on the views of the National Conference on Governance and Administration. This is very important. Again, the partners in Juba Peace 2020 discussed the issue of tax and then agreed on it without constitutional arrangement. And this is very important point. Local acts not established well. The constitutional declaration also neglected the localities, I mean the councils, as a basis for governance and equal manner for all citizens in each region of Sudan. Again, the government didn't organize local governments to cure deep-rooted problems relevant to this system, I mean the decentralization. Also, the split of the main leading political coalition of the post-uprising transitional government and pay much more attention to the structure of decentralization and to enhance public policy will assist in stability of state and success of region. I would like to stress in 3 regions, the Blue Nile district, Nuba Mountains or Southern Kordofan state, and the third is the Darfur region. In terms of governance, the agreement emphasizes the maintenance of Sudan's unity and decentralization. The main challenge in this respect here is how to achieve justice and good local governance in the Blue Nile region. Also, legal reform, rebuilding the region, accountability, a dimension of good governance, access to information for all citizens in this region, and all other activities are depending mainly on the rule of law and transparency, and maybe also responsiveness. The question here, how to create channels for mass mass participation in decision making, and to give localities the right so as to prepare their own development projects and plans. In southern Kordofan or Nuba Mountains, autonomous self-government, the status of local government as a former region does not enjoy either strong constitutional status and a relatively high degree of autonomy, policy making, and financial independence. And this region, through the history, neglected by the central government. It may affect the process and the future of decentralization and local government stability in the region of Kordofan as a whole, not in southern Kordofan only. Maybe collective participation may require the regional government to introduce a series of legislative measures whereby local authorities will subject service to competitive tendering. The third region, this is very large region, therefore, the new situation in decentralization, or before that, in fact, this region includes 5 states. Therefore, region gained exclusive powers at the level of regional government, 30 functions and duties, very huge functions gained to this large region. 2 of those powers define the function and competencies of local governance according to exclusive power defined by the region. In fact, the gaps in the later agreement may need to be fulfilled in the new national constitution. The constitutional declaration specified the types of regional state governance, yet it didn't mention the issue of local government as a basis level of governance. And we see here the marginalization through the history. In general, it is very important that decentralization allows local communities and other local entities to arrange their own affairs in order to achieve their priorities and needs in context of strong intergovernmental relation. This is very important. I will move to the role of non-state actors and the private sector in the decentralized system of government in Sudan. It is a matter of fact, several external actors might have had a significant role in assisting Sudan's transition to good governance. At 3 levels or 3 tiers of government and subsidiary administrative units. The activists or activities of private sector, this is very important also, and NGOs in Sudan will not to successfully achieve much progress unless the political atmosphere in Sudan enables them play their role perfectly. Again, local governments should strengthen the local council relation with the private sector and trade union. The experience with civil society organization in Sudan indicate that they can be very useful in certain sphere of development. I'm talking about sustainable development in the 3rd level of government. Also, civil society at the moment in Sudan is to endeavor to limit the excessive of government and integrate themselves with the government decision and authority. The structure imposed by state government in process and for absent role of private sector in enhancing governance. The role of private sector is very important in the 3rd level of government and also in enhancing governance. Outputs and recommendations. Decentralization is a key issue for Sudan as it consists of increased transfer of public functions from central government to lower levels of governance. But it hasn't yet reflected its true values in practice and hasn't enhanced governance in its various meaning in the country. Local governance in Sudan needs greater partnership to encourage people not only to participate in its local and regional council, but also to enhance further future political participation. The weak situation of decentralization in Sudan had created challenge gloomy when local leaders conduct government functions without giving consideration to the rule of law and due to transparency in most regions of Sudan, particularly in Darfur, Blue Nile region, and Southern Kordofan region. Local governance also becomes loose and potentially uncontrollable. The study reached, by paper, several results. The most important findings include 3 points. First, the local governance is weak because for ineffectiveness of intergovernmental relations to share region in designing policy and local development control. The second point, the research also discovered weaknesses of institutional arrangements at all 3 levels of government, particularly at the newly created regions and arrangement within the existing system of decentralization. Third, the inactive role of partners to the governance was not driving purposes of the policy and improvement of efficient service delivery. I have 5 recommendations. The first one, comprehensive reform of the state organization to ensure robust institutional management regarding policy and administration. Second, the regions in Sudan need more devolution, not delegations. This is very important. More devolution of power to lower level of government by constitutional provisions. Local governments should have their own independent financial budget and greater authorities over their own local sources to enable them to provide public service to the citizen. Achieving peace, and without peace, it is difficult to talk about stability. Achieving peace in 3 regions and stability to successfully implement asymmetrical regional governance so as to effectively and equitably deliver basic public service and enhance sustainable development. 5, strengthening the ability of the country's executive organs to accept partnership with other stakeholders and stabilizing the balance of power among the regions component of Sudan. And finally, the government of Sudan should adopt smart strategic political partnership with other stakeholders, including trade unions, so as or in order to fill the gap in local government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mushaika, for, again, another interesting presentation, which talks about the decentralization and local governance in Sudan, by looking at structures as well as the legal frameworks, and also challenge on these areas and also beyond by citing a number of political issues. Now we'll proceed to the next presentation by Dr. Fagada, which will basically summarize and present some discussions from not only from the presentations that we had today, but also from the presentations that we had during the previous week on Kenya and Uganda. So it will be dealing with the 5 cases: Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Sudan. Dr. Fagada, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Are you hearing me? Do you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Freud, the moderator. Mine is a very simple job. I'm tasked to provide a very brief summary of the papers that are submitted for this research project. Good Governance Africa, its Eastern Africa office, initiated this research project very much consciously with regard to the utility of both decentralization and local governance in terms of enabling the local people to articulate interests and, of course, involved in the process of making decisions that affect their interests, concerns at the local level. In the I mean, from all the presentations, we have gathered that decentralization, at least for the purpose of this research project, can best be understood as a transfer of authority and responsibility for public functions from the central government downwards into the intermediate and local and quasi-independent governmental structures. And again, on the other hand, local governance is conceived as something that comprises a set of institutions, mechanisms, processes through which citizens articulate their interests, they mediate their differences, exercise their rights, and of course, attend to their obligations. So, in many ways, local governance is understood as something that creates an enabling environment whereby stakeholders interact to foster local development processes. So conceiving decentralization and local governance as such, in Africa generally, and particularly in the case studies, the 5 countries that are in the eastern part of the continent, local governance, it appears that local governance was accorded, yes, significance, was taken as an issue of concern from the time of independence. Nonetheless, as you very much articulated well last week and today, authoritarian politics at the center has always been inhibited in terms of practicing the autonomy that appears on paper. So the fact that local governance was accorded significance can be seen, for instance, in reference to the declarations, statutory provisions, and statements that came out of regional organizations. like for instance, the African Development Bank concept paper of 2005, the African Union Yaoundé Declaration of 2005, again, the African Charter on Election, Democracy and Governance of 2007, the African Charter on the Values, Principles of Decentralization, Local Governance and Local Development of 2014. All these recognize the importance of decentralization and local governance, mainly attaching significance to them as something enabling to foster development. So the demand for local autonomy arose from a collusion of kind of three forces. One appears to be in the shape of local demands for greater autonomy in their relation with the center, because since the time of independence, central authoritarian politics has always been a failure in terms of delivering to, attending to the interests and concerns of the local people. So the failure of authoritarian politics on the one hand, and again, the resulting demand for greater autonomy by the local people has been a force that brought the issue of local governance to the forefront. And besides this, the spread of this, what is known as the wave of democratization in the 90s, first half of in the 80s. Actually, it started mid-70s, covering the next 2 decades. So this wave of democratization set a kind of an example to emulate from, and that also was a force to be recognized in terms of bringing that agenda again to the forefront. A third important factor that led to the rise of this demand for local autonomy may be related to the instrumental use of this thing by international organizations like the they made a condition that recipients delve into such an agenda of pushing ahead, yes, decentralization and local governance. So a collusion of these forces may explain why in the last 3-4 decades, right, decentralization and local governance has come to the forefront. Despite this, however, in many cases, the practice has always been dismal. For instance, yes, a brief mention of the some of the important points of the presentations from the case studies, alphabetically again. In Ethiopia, for instance, in recent time, in the last 3 decades, there was an attempt at decentralization. And then since the change of regime in May 1991, it was the following year, 1992, that such an attempt was made during the period of transition with the issuance of Proclamation number 7, 1992. But again, it was in 1995 that the country was federalized, and out of this process, 9 regional governments and 2 federal cities emerged. This may have provided the landscape within which a measure of local autonomy may be practiced. However, the issue of local governance, although the country was federalized and the regional governments have their own constitution by which they provide for the establishment of local governments, and by which again they accorded them a measure of autonomy, right? Local governments do not have a federal constitutional protection. And again, it was only as of 2002, with reforms unleashed then, following a major political upheaval, local governments were given a form of autonomy, some form of autonomy, and then new kinds of institutional arrangements. But again, the fact that powers and functions of local governments are not clearly defined across regions tells you to what extent they have not been given due consideration and recognition. One important point to mention in this regard is the fact that there has never been a local election since 2008. For more than a decade and possibly half, right? Nearly a decade and a half, there has never been a local election in this country. And this in itself tells you the level of significance that they're accorded with. In Kenya, my colleague, my friend Gedeon was presenting last week. There was a brief exercise in regional arrangements since 1963-64, the time of independence. But again, the issue of local governments has always been a part of the political debate ever since. The reason perhaps relates to the fact that powerful forces in local government are always been provincial administrations that are unelected bodies, right, accountable to the center than to local structures of governance. So provinces are simply considered as proxies of ethnicity by the politicians. So it was, I mean, some form of development emerged only as a result of the taking effect of the 2010 constitution, which resulted in the creation of about 45 counties with corporate status, right? So devolving, yes, some executive and legislative functions to local governmental units. But again, judicial function was not devolved to these newly established, yes, county governments. It was only executive and legislative, right, powers. And again, in 2012, the country issued the County Government Act, right? In some other countries do not have such an act tailored, pointed to the issue of local government. They derive only provisions from constitutional, yes, articles. But in the Kenyan case, for instance, in 2012, there is a separate piece of law, the form of the County Government Act, that provided for the establishment of county, laid down the arrangement of local governance structures. There are counties at the top, under which there are sub-counties, wards, village administrations, right? And this provided for a local governmental structure. In spite of this, however, particularly from a financial point of view, yes, the issue has been of serious concern and a matter of contest because of the fact that local governments have never been, even since then, right, according to levy taxes, generate revenue, and approve budget by themselves. So they are very much dependent upon central transfers. And so the performance in this regard is again dismal. Another important feature of the Kenyan experience is there is a coincidence of old and new structures. Old structures that are bequeathed from the earlier decades, and new structures that resulted from the 2010 constitution and the 2012 county government act. So the fusion of the two, right? The coexistence of the two led to confusion by citizens, and it created a kind of unhealthy tension between the two systems that coexist ever since. There are also duplication of rules and trading of blame for policy delivery failures. In Rwanda, as Frederick was telling us, the country adopted a decentralization policy in 2001. There was also constitutional provision pertaining to decentralization in 2005, the aim of which was empowering districts as local tiers of the governance system. A follow-up in terms of the policy and legal framework is the 2007 decentralization strategic framework, right? So what came out of these policy frameworks is the arrangement of local governments, right, in different hierarchical structures, at the top of which are districts, followed by sectors, and then cities, and then villages, some more than 2,000, as he was telling us earlier. Now, despite such an arrangement and a regulatory framework in terms of policy and legal provisions, right, and local governments heavily rely on, again, central government transfers. I mean, successful ones, he wrote, Frederick wrote, successful ones could generate as high as 60% of their requirements, financial requirements, and those that are not doing well generate only as low as 20% of their financial requirements. This figure itself is telling, right, to what extent local government structures in Rwanda are very much dependent upon the central government for their operations. Coming to Sudan, right? Sudan, since independence, again, the issue was considered. In 1960, 1972, there were provisions contained in the constitution, in the provisions, legal frameworks pertaining to local governance, and again subsequently carried over into the 1973 constitution. A further development in this regard is the 1991 decision that the country to federalize a state, and the subsequent proclamation of a new constitution in 1990. So as a result of these developments in Sudan, you find a spearheading institution in the shape of the Ministry of the Interior, responsible for supervising, controlling, coordinating local government structures that were established as a result of the framework that I was mentioning earlier. So granting greater administrative responsibilities to subnational entities remains meaningless without effective devolution of fiscal and economic power, however. Despite the novelty that the Constitution contains certain provisions pertaining to local governments, it shies away, on the other hand, from providing for the requisite, the necessary financial, and economic basis for the operation of local government structure. So central governments in Khartoum always control, most controversial policies in the country, marginalize the peripheries, and didn't, in many cases, as Hassan was telling us, uphold the rule of law, So what came out of these developments is the flare-up of conflicts, the recurrence of conflicts between the center and the periphery. And a watershed in this regard is the separation of the South in 2011. And again, you know, the Darfur case and many other similar cases in different parts of that country, Western, Eastern, Southern, right? So although there are the constitutional provisions, there is also a shortfall in terms of implementation. One aspect of the shortfall could be, for instance, there has never been a space, as Hassan was telling us, for non-governmental entities to take part into the process of governing at the local level, right? Those CSOs, private, right, entities have a stake and a role to play in the governing process at the local level. Yes, there has never been, yes, meaningful, yes, space for them to take part in the process of governing at the local level, right? So autonomy for decision making has never been meaningful in the case of Sudan. Now, Uganda, similar experience. This is the last. I'll take a minute and a half or two. Now, Uganda, 1987, after the resistance that led to the ouster of Wate, right? And then so there was the resistance council's statute later that later the foundation for local government. This was for the previous axioms, and again the 1995 Constitution and the 1997 Local Government Act, which, right, provided the policy and legal framework for the establishment and the parameter of operation of local government units in Uganda. But again, Uganda's local governments exist of course, as provided for in the policy and statutes. Uganda's local governments exist at different levels, distinguished between rural and urban local governments since the 1995 Constitution, right? So the 1995 Constitution can be taken as a framework of operation of as something that provided for the establishment and operation of local governments. It provided for devolution of power, and Uganda's local government landscape for almost 3 decades has been conditioned by what is provided for in the 1995 Constitution of the country. But then the contention on the part of writers of this chapter, Moses and Sebastian, right? The creation of many districts in post-1995 Uganda neither conforms to the policy objective of bringing services closer to the people, nor to promoting participatory democratic governance. Instead, they contend, right, the practice conforms to central government gerrymandering tactics of forging an electoral alliance with small jurisdictions and to extend neo-patrimonial networks to win voters in order to stay in power. That is the logic behind, right, the creation, recreation, right, the division and the redivision of local governments in their views. So Uganda's districtization process facilitates, in their views, re-centralization in effect. Why? It happened then, and it happened reducing intergovernmental bargaining power between local governments and central governments as threatened with fragmentation to weaken their power. 2, it led to re-centralization by weakening local governments' capacity to mobilize enough local revenues, rendering them financially dependent on the center. And 3, it led to re-centralization in effect by expanding the reach of central elites patronage networks, right? So summarizing, right? in terms of, by way of summarizing the Ugandan experience, this redistrictization is part of the ongoing practice of national fragmentation, which has increased elite power capture, exclusion of accountability, and service delivery failures, is what the authors contend upon. And in 2001, they say, look, in the 2001 Local Government Act, the 2001 local institutional provisions, of course. However, performance, they say, is still dismal in terms of service delivery. I mean, Moses will allow me to quote from that chapter that illustrates to what extent local governments have been a failure in terms of delivering services at the local level. They contend, and a case in point is, in terms of service delivery, they say, a case in point is education, right? When grade 3 students were asked recently to read a sentence such as, the name of the dog is Puppy, 3/4 didn't understand what it said. So is how dismal, right, service provision by local governments is, at least in the realm of education. Now, having summarized, right, the major points that I've seen in all the chapters and presentations of the 5 cases, if I may, I will raise some issues for discussion. For instance, I see that the shift from governing to governance conceptually, right? What the case with a shift from governing to governance, in my view, merits, yes, a measure of discussion in this webinar, because governing, yes, in the traditional public administration conception is all about controlling, is about an exclusive exercise of power by state structures only, without taking in the role of non-state actors, rule bound, right, this and that. But the style of governing in governance is very much different in my view. So the need for shifting from governing to governance in the context of the papers that we have been discussing, I think merits, right, a couple of minutes to this case. And again, local government in almost all of the papers have been portrayed as right, instruments in practice, instruments of control and patronage by central governments. And the why of the issue, right, should merit, I mean, in my view, yes, a bit more discussion. With regard to the way forward, right, I mean, on policy and legal frameworks, the deficits, right, in this regard merit again, right, some form of discussion. And again, whether countries need to have a spearheading institution responsible for governing, for coordinating, controlling, supervising local governments. This again could be another area of discussion. In some countries like Sudan, for instance, the Ministry of the Interior is responsible, right, for supervising, coordinating, controlling this and that. In some other countries, there is no such, right, structure responsible for doing that. So the merit of having it, right, should be, could be, I see, yes, as something useful for discussion. And again, the balance between autonomy and accountability. Yes, of course, local governments need to be autonomous in many forms, not only in finance, but also in terms of warding off unfair interference in their operations from the center as well, right? So the autonomy on the one hand, but again, accountability on the other for whatever they do, right? Accountability to the local citizens, accountability, right, upwards to the center, I don't know, right, the balance the nice mix, the nice balance between the two. Again, I feel merits a bit more, right, discussion. And again, in governance, as a new form of, as a new style of governing, right? There, at least conceptually, there needs to be a space for non-state actors, like civil societies, right? Like private actors. In some countries, for instance, local government projects are contracted out to, right? Private firms, right? Which work together with the local government structure. In some other countries, there is experience that civil society organizations, yes, work with local government arrangement. The idea is, right, the role of the public units in local government, in local governments, the role of public offices is only to steer, right, the process of interaction of all stakeholders in terms of decision making, in terms of monitoring the implementation of what has been decided, and yes, things of this sort. So the need for a space for non-state actors, again, in my view, merits, right, some more discussion in this regard. So Dr. Freud, the moderator, I'm done. Thank you very much for the time you have given.
Thank you very much for that very rich, not only summary, but very much an analytical input in terms of also comparing the 5 cases. I apologize for participants to go beyond the time that we initially allotted for this webinar. We're supposed to end at 4:30, but because we also started a bit late, 30 minutes late actually, I kindly request everyone to stay a bit more so that we can entertain a few burning questions. So maybe if you can raise hands, we can take maybe 2 questions. And then there are also some questions in the chat that we can take up. So I see Ambassador Rui. I think that's Ambassador Rui. And then another one by Iyo. Okay, so we'll take these 2. Please, Ambassador Rui, you can start.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very informative. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, for the very informative webinar. I think it's very important that this subject has been taken up in these countries in East and the Horn of Africa. As you know, the history of the countries here have included one of separatism and splitting into different countries as well. So questions of decentralization and so on are important, relevant to us. I just wanted to ask Dr. Hassan Misheka a couple of questions relating to Sudan. One is relates to, given the history of Sudan and the different components of Sudan, I think you referred to different levels of autonomy in different parts of Sudan. I may not have gotten it entirely right, but do you see in Sudan in the future the possibility of having different levels of autonomy in a federal system, which takes into account particularities and let's say the existing histories of some of the regions and so on? That's one question. Secondly, I wanted to ask Dr. Hassan again, is there any resistance to decentralization or to federal arrangements in Sudan? If I recall back in the time of the latter date of President Nimeri, when there was an attempt at a national dialogue, I understand that federalism was recommended. Is there resistance to federalism and decentralization today? And if so, If so, where does it come from and how widespread is it? Finally, do you see federalism or decentralization as assisting the movement of people and their livelihood from one part of Sudan to the other? Or do you see it as hindering the movement of people from one side of Sudan to the other? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Huri. Ayub, Dr. Ayub, you can ask a question. Sorry.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Prayut. Thank you, the presenters. It was quite informative. I have one general comment and questions to Dr. Asnak and Dr. Frederick. My general comment is, I think we are very much still trapped in that famous diagnostic verdict of the World Bank in its 1989 report, where it defined Africa's problem is a crisis of governance, then unleashed and supported a massive push for the good governance agenda, a very technocratic approach to address historical, political, economic problems in a very normative sense, in a very simplistic manner, where the model of the Western world was considered as idealistic. And the case of Africa is quite backward. It's something that needs to be followed, and that model needs to be copy-pasted. I think we're very much trapped in that framework in our thinking. And that's why probably I would see that we are still studying our societies, our state structures, national, local level state structures, for what they are not, for what they lack, rather than for what they are. That's why we usually come up with just saying that they lack this, they lack X, Y, Z, and they don't do this and that. I think we would have a very different understanding, even analytical approach, if we can at least step aside and see and start to study our societies for what they are and the kind of problems or the kind of solutions that they are providing for a number of issues. It's based on this comment that I will ask Dr. Asnak and Dr. Frederick, like, what, at least for the case of Ethiopia and Rwanda, at least we can say that the elite in the, at least during Malda Zenawi's eras, and still I assume under Kagame's regime, that developmentalist orientation, the determination to address the fundamental problems of our society, that's its productive capacity to remain heavily reliant on the West and not be able to produce what it consumes. You know, that pushing that aspect of development is quite very much at the center, at least in the developmentalist aspect of EPRDF and in Kagame's region. So what kind of merit had that kind of, for instance, the politicization of the decentralization process, which initially is, of course, in Ethiopian case, for instance, has delivered? Can we, if we make a balance sheet of Ethiopia's period of decentralization of federalism in terms of its development outcomes, if we make a balance sheet, what has been achieved and what's lacking? Can we make this kind of diagnosis? And also for Rwanda as well. You mentioned clearly some of the technical challenge, but what about the achievements? What about the positive elements? So that we are not just simply studying our countries for what they are not or for what they lack, but also for what they have achieved over the past at least 2 decades. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question by Moses, and that will be the last one.
Thank you, and I'll be very brief since we are out of time. I have a quick question for Dr. Snake and a quick question for Dr. Frederick Goloba Mutevi. So for Dr. Snake, in light of what has unfolded in Ethiopia's federal landscape, does the country perhaps better suit a confederation model rather than federalism, considering the constituent units as they are? And this kind of speaks to the way in which we implement these kinds of policies without putting into consideration the actual conditions and the actual context. It looks to me like the federal arrangement in Ethiopia is perhaps not very well suited for the country's socio-political landscape, but perhaps a different approach should have been pursued. And then I wanted to hear from Dr. Goloba about the role of local political elites and what they have done to either carry forward the decentralization agenda in Rwanda, or perhaps undermine it in the manner that we see with other African countries. So the role of local political elites vis-a-vis the bureaucratic setup and the central government and so on and so forth. I would be interested in hearing your reflections on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we will have the presenters respond to some of the questions that were forwarded. Yeah, so we'll start with Dr. Asnaga, and I really urge the presenters to be really brief because we don't have a lot of time. Okay, so Dr. Asnaga, you can go. And there are also questions in the chat, so it's good if you can also reflect on the questions. So the first one is how legitimate are elected local structures where opposition groups have boycotted the elections? So this is sort of a general question where we talked about boycotts of election. And another point is considering the overall capacity limitations in our part of the world, is it sufficient to blame decentralization in and of itself for the service delivery failures in our countries? So basically, is it only decentralization to blame? Another one is a comment by Dr. Mohammed. So the general assumption in more decentralization was that local governments help to bring about socio-economic development and the delivery of social services. That's why IMF and World Bank push for more decentralization. However, decentralization in some cases brought more decentralized corruption and incompetency at local levels. Local governments are becoming agents of central governments and used as a means to control local population political mobilization for winning elections. Basically, what particularly Dr. Asnaga was saying also earlier. So we can now go to the responses. So I'm sorry, Dr. Asnaga. Dr. Frederick would like to go first since he has another commitment. So Dr. Frederick, you can go first, and then that will be followed by Dr. Asnaga. And please be brief.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very quickly, I will start with Moses, the question that Moses posed. The question of what the local elites do. You know, Rwanda is a very interesting place in that you have a very, very strong central government. Now, the central government keeps a very, very close eye on what local officials do. And that's why I said that they retain fairly significant powers of control and supervision. And actually, to kind of make this even clearer, not too long ago, I was investigating the question of corruption in Rwanda. And I remember asking how the anti-corruption agencies are able to keep an eye on what everybody is doing. And actually what the official I was talking to told me that they identify those parts of the government where where corruption is said to be at its highest. And that's where they watch very carefully. And he mentioned local government as one of those arenas where they keep a very, very close eye. So in terms of elite capture of processes at the local level, there is, but very minimal. I have some examples of local government officials being arrested. I think the turnover of mayors in Rwanda is the highest I've ever heard of. Mayors are forced to resign very regularly. And in fact, it causes a certain level of instability in local government. So there isn't as much as we see here in Uganda, because the center asserts its authority to control and supervise and inspect very, very strongly. Now, the question by Ayob about the gains or the achievements of decentralization in Rwanda. Now, a lot of people who come to Rwanda do comment, for instance, on how clean the country is. Now, the cleanliness that you see in Rwanda is the work of local government. And in part, it's the work of local government in mobilizing local communities to keep their environment clean. I have done a lot of work on social services, on health. I've done work on agriculture. Local governments may not have all the resources they need, but their performance is very high. And partly it has to do again with the factor that I mentioned, the fact that there is very strong central control. And in fact, local governments do implement most of the programs and activities that are supposed to be implemented by ministries. Ministries ask local governments to do a lot of things for them, but those requests must be accompanied by the commensurate financial resources. So that in many ways has forced local governments to perform to a very high degree as opposed to what you see elsewhere. But also we have to keep in mind that the issue of service delivery in Rwanda is pretty much one of the ways in which the RPF legitimates its hold on power. I mean, it has to deliver high quality education, high quality health. It has to make sure productivity in agriculture is worked on. So all those things combine to explain a great deal of what we see happening in Rwanda. And in Uganda, I think that the idea that autonomous local governments to which power has been devolved are going to be effective at delivering services or performing their functions. I think that the paper on Uganda by Moses and Sebastian can show exactly how mistaken that idea can be. Thank you. I don't think there was any other question directed at me. Those two are the ones I captured. If there's anything I left out, somebody should remind me, because after this, I'm going to beg to leave.
That's fine, Dr. Mutebi. Can we now go to Dr. Asnaka? And again, can you please be brief in the interest of time, since we are already spent more time than we should. Dr. Asmaga, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry. I'll be brief. The first question and comment came from Leo about the World Bank, the Western model. He said rightly, we try to identify African states for what they are not, but at the same time, even looking at Ethiopian political history for a very long period of time, there was this effort of bringing Western institutions, Western bureaucracy, Western education. So the situation is not, I think, very clear. There is no neat boundary between traditional institutions or African kind of governance systems and Western systems of governance. What the World Bank brought, the structural adjustment program, it has been heavily criticized, but in this paper, I was not that much interested about the technocratic solutions which the World Bank brought, rather how local governments were organized under the federal system by the EPRDF, what has been achieved and what was not achieved. So coming to the question of EOB about the developmental state, where is the balance sheet? Yes, many things were achieved since the beginning of the developmental state model by the EPRDF. After, particularly, there were ideas about state control, the role of the state, enhanced role of the state in the economy, even before the 2005 elections. But I think we need to historicize also why the developmental state became the leading ideology or slogan of the EPRDF. It was after the 2005 elections, when political legitimacy was not achieved by the EPRDF. Even some of the people working with the EPRDF came with the idea of performance legitimacy. Our legitimacy does not come from popular legitimacy elections, rather through social services, infrastructure, and others. But the idea of the developmental state hugely compromised local autonomy. You remember the story about even the Western caricature, like land grab, land investment, loans, many other things. Some of the excess of the developmental state happened in this period. There was a lot of corruption. The authorities of local governments and regional governments were violated. The federal government was managing land, investment, and others. So even if there were some achievements in the developmental state project, the developmental state project itself also contributed to the political instability that we have now. So I think the balance sheet, yes, there were some achievements as well as difficulties. Usually, political crises happen, conflicts when economy is not doing well. But in the Ethiopian case, the reverse was the case. So I think the developmental state approach, the way it was implemented in Ethiopia, was problematic. It undermined private initiative. It gave too much power to the party. There was no any distinction between the party and the state. There was corruption. So all these things cumulatively contributed to the political crisis that we have now. The question raised by Moses about what kind of political system will be suitable to Ethiopia, he said a confederal arrangement could be more favorable to the situation in Ethiopia. I beg to differ. I don't think so. Looking at the history of federations and even confederations, there is not a very good history of confederation. Federalism has its own challenges in the Ethiopian context. I believe in the importance of a federal system of government. The federal system of government in Ethiopia gave too much emphasis to local identity, ethnic identity. In the constitution and even in the implementation, there was more interest about the division than things that bring the people of the country together. I think the way forward in Ethiopia should be reforming the federal system, respecting the rights of the communities to use their languages, to administer themselves, but at the same time, some of the excesses with respect to the rights of minorities, with respect to several challenges that we encounter today, need to be modified. I don't think it will be possible or even important to go back to a unitary system of government. I don't think confederalism will be also an option. There is no any historical experience that could provide us a good guidance about successful confederations. I thank my intervention. I stop here. Thank you, Rayod.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Asnaka. I now invite Dr. Musheika to particularly reflect on the two questions that were asked by Ambassador Nouri.
Okay. Thank you very much Mr. Ambassador, for your good questions. In fact, Sudan adopted decentralization through its long history. But as I said, the government in Khartoum always dominated on the region, on the different region of Sudan, and also on the local governments itself. If we look to the Act 1991, which made by Marshall, Arthur Hadley Marshall, and the other act, which done by Jafar Muhammad Ali Bakhit, we will find the difference between two acts. And during Nimeri government, there was a new permanent constitution in 19 of federalism in the house. And one of these initiatives also was further decentralization of power away from the capital Khartoum. This is very important. And in any case, decentralization is a key issue. Is a key issue for Sudan, as it consists of increasing transfer of power, of transfer of public function from the central government to lower level of governance. What the general situation in the present transitional period in Sudan had reached the highest degree of complexity. You ask about more autonomous to other regions. I'm afraid Darfur may separate in the future if the government didn't consider this very important region and made a conference to do new arrangement, and to focus more about the level of regional institutions and careful arrangement at the level also of local governance. This is very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the presenters as well as the participants for holding this conversation, very important conversation on decentralization and local governance in these countries in Eastern Africa. And we'll have a closing, finally we'll have a closing by Dr. Zariun Mohammed, the Executive Director of Good Governance Africa, Eastern Africa, and that will be the end of today's webinar. Dr. Zariun, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Freud. I don't want to take your time anymore. I'm here just to say a few words of thanks to the people who are involved on this program. I would like to thank all the researchers involved in this project: Frederick, Hassan, Asnaga, Gideon, Moses, and Sebastian. Thank you very much. You have done really a very good work. It's very difficult to do it in different places, but it's really wonderful working with you guys. I would like to also thank the Civil Society Resource Center, which really facilitated the two workshops we had in these 2 days. Well, they are doing this free of charge with all the supporters we are getting from, including Amin, Adai, Zuha. We really thank and appreciate. We also thank Dr. Freud, who is moderating today's workshop, and also our moderator last week from Addis Ababa University. Thank you very much. I would like also thank the people in my office, particularly Dr. Fakada, who was coordinating this research. Thank you, Fakada, for marvelous work you are doing with remote control, people from different countries. That's really wonderful. So thank you, participants, for your patience. I really apologize for the technical glitch we have today. And hopefully, when we learn more about the technology, when we have control of the technology, we will manage better. But thank you very much for your patience. We'll continue these projects and we'll do more on the papers. And hopefully, inshallah, we'll publish and distribute to all of you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your participation. Thank you.